Hello. Welcome to the last of Marilynne Robinson's 4 Terry lectures titled The Absence of Mind, the Dispelling of Inwardness from the Modern Myth of the Self. I'm Amy Hungerford. I am a professor in the English department. I want to thank Marilynne Robinson and also the Terry Lectureship for this wonderful series. It's really just kind of a gift given to all us literary types who wander around Lindsley Chittenden Hall day in and day out. It's a great gift to us, and we invite the audience to a celebratory reception following the talk in the lobby outside the lecture hall. I teach contemporary American fiction, and in that capacity, it is my privilege, and last week it was my privilege, to invite 118 students this spring to read Marilynne Robinson's first novel, Housekeeping. In doing so, I'm inviting them to listen to the voice of that narrator in that novel, a young girl. And in so doing, I'm offering them the chance to listen to a very human voice, a very beautiful human voice, the beautiful human voice of thought. A questioner in Tuesday's talk asked what might be the positive understanding of the mind that would replace the various modern conceptions of the mind that our speaker has critiqued over the last 3 lectures. And it has been a fairly thorough critique, a kind of clearing, as she has said, of dead wood. In the first lecture, she gave an account of how philosophical skepticism and what she has called parascience have robbed the experience of being human of its rightful dignity and weight, an experience that includes all sorts of thoughts and feelings, including the sense of transcendence and the impulse of altruism, that latter becoming then the subject of her second lecture. In her third lecture, Ms. Robinson challenged the way Freudian narratives of the self ask us also to distrust experience, to see our feelings as a mask for suppressed sexual desire. It's in the very way, though, that Marilynne Robinson pursued those critiques that I think you see the solution to their bankruptcy or the solution to their emptiness in asking us to consider, for instance, as she did, the rage of Phineas Gage, who is often cited in his terrible industrial accident, which destroyed his frontal lobe, cited as proof that our moral sense is simply a product of our neurological wiring, in asking us to think about his rage and the pain that he suffered, in asking us to think in Tuesday's lectures about what it meant for Freud to be a Jew in anti-Semitic Vienna. She asks us to see theory as a form of human thought and human speaking that can't be divorced from that ocean of feeling and thought and experience we are daily in the grips of, that really is the substance of the human condition. The answer to what replaces modern distrust of experience and thought, I think, can be found in her novels in just this way, precisely in the voices of thought they contain and to which we can listen. It is a pleasure, then, to anticipate the voice of humane thought, learned, sustained, funny, and compassionate, that we will now hear in the final of Marilynne Robinson's Terry Lectures, titled Thinking Again. Please welcome Marilynne Robinson.
It's a great pleasure to be here. It always is. And thank you for coming. It will be a great day in the history of science if we sometime discover a damp shadow elsewhere in the universe where a fungus has sprouted. The mere fossil trace of life in its simplest form would be the crowning achievement of generations of brilliant and diligent labor. And here we are, a gaudy efflorescence of consciousness, staggeringly improbable in light of everything we know about the reality that contains us. There are physicists and philosophers who would correct me. They would say if there are an infinite number of universes, as in theory there could be, then creatures like us would be very likely to emerge at some time in one of them. But to say this is only to state the fact of our improbability in other terms. Then there is the odd privilege of existence as a coherent self, the ability to speak the word I and mean by it a richly individual history of experience, perception, and thought. For the religious, the sense of the soul may have as a final redoubt, not as argument, but as experience, that haunting I who wakes us in the night wondering where time has gone, the I we waken to sharply aware that we have been unfaithful to ourselves, that a life lived otherwise would have acknowledged a yearning more our own than any of the daylit motives whose behests we answer to so diligently. Our religious traditions give us the name of God, as the name of God, two deeply mysterious words, one deeply mysterious utterance, I am. Putting to one side the question of their meaning as the name and character by which the God of Moses would be known, these are words any human being can say about herself, and does say, though always with a modifier of some kind. I am hungry, I am comfortable, I am a singer, I am a cook. The abrupt descent into particularity in every statement of this kind, being itself made an auxiliary to some momentary accident of being, may only startle in the dark of night when the intuition comes that there is no proportion between the great given of existence and the narrow vessel of circumstance into which it is inevitably forced. I am Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. There is much speculation about the nature of the mind, its relation to the brain, even doubt that the word mind is meaningful. According to E.O. Wilson, the brain and its satellite glands have now been probed to the point where no particular site remains that can reasonably be supposed to harbor a non-physical mind, end of quote. Perhaps this statement is to be taken as tongue-in-cheek, but to prove a negative or to treat it as having been proved is, oddly enough, an old and essential strategy of positivism. So I do feel obliged to point out that if such a site could be found in the brain, then the mind would be physical in the same sense that anything else with a locus in the brain is physical. To define the mind as non-physical in the first place clearly prejudices his conclusion. Steven Pinker on the Soul asks, how does the spook interact with solid matter? How does an ethereal nothing respond to flashes, pokes, and beeps and get arms and legs to move? Another problem is the overwhelming evidence that the mind is the activity of the brain. The supposedly immaterial soul we now know can be bisected with a knife, altered by chemicals, end of quote, and so on. By identifying the soul with the mind with the brain, and noting the brain's vulnerability as a physical object, he feels he has debunked a conception of the soul that only those who find the word meaningless would ever have entertained. This declension from the ethereality of the mind-soul as spirit to the reality of the mind-brain as lump of meat is dependent conceptually for its effects on precisely the antique dualism these writers who claim to speak for science believe they reject and refute. If complex life is the marvel we all say it is, quite possibly unique to this planet, then meat is, so to speak, that marvel in its incarnate form. It was dualism that pitted the spirit against the flesh, investing spirit with all that is lofty at the expense of flesh, which is understood by contrast as coarse and base. It only perpetuates dualist thinking to treat the physical as if it were in any way sufficiently described in disparaging terms. If the mind is the activity of the brain, this means only that the brain is capable of such lofty and astonishing things that their expression has been given the names mind and soul and spirit. Complex life may well be the wonder of the universe, And if it is, its status is not diminished by the fact that we can indeed bisect it, that we kill it routinely. In any case, Wilson's conception of mind clearly has also taken on the properties of the soul, at least as that entity is understood by those eager to insist that there is no ghost in the machine. As Bertrand Russell pointed out decades before Gilbert Ryle coined this potent phrase, the old, confident distinction between materiality and non-materiality is not a thing modern science can endorse. Physicists say a change in a split photon occurs simultaneously in its severed half at any theoretical distance. As if there were no time or space, this information of change passes instantly from one to the other. Is an event that defies any understanding we have of causality a physical event? Yes. Can the seeming timelessness and spacelessness that mediate this change also be called physical? Presumably, since they have unambiguous physical consequences. Then perhaps we cannot claim to know the nature of the physical, and perhaps we ought not to be so confident in opposing it to a real or imagined non-physical. These terms, as conventionally used, are not identical with the terms real and unreal, though the belief that they are is the oldest tenet of positivism. The old notion of dualism should be put aside now that we know a little about the uncanny properties of the finer textures of the physical. If, as some have suggested, quantum phenomena govern the brain, evidence for the fact is not likely to be found in scrutiny of lobes or glands or by means of any primitive understanding of the brain's materiality. Let us say the mind is what the brain does. This is a definition that makes the mind, whatever else, a participant in the whole history and experience of the body. Steven Pinker offers the same definition but modifies it differently. He says, the mind is what the brain does. Specifically, the brain processes information, and thinking is a kind of computation, end of quote. Excluding the felt experience of thinking with all its diverse burdens and colorations. Elsewhere, he says, with the certitude typical of his genre, family feelings are designed to help our genes replicate themselves, but we cannot see or smell genes. I note here that that's useful information. To continue, our emotions about kin use a kind of inverse genetics to guess which of the organisms we interact with are likely to share our genes. For example, if someone appears to have the same parents as you do, treat the person as if their genetic well-being overlaps with yours. End of quote. And again, we have the self we experience at a qualitative remove from what the brain really does. Presumably, we are seduced into collaborating in the perpetuation of some part of our genetic inheritance by those moments of love and embrace. But why are these seductions necessary? Why are they lovely to us? Why would nature bother to distract us with them? Why do we stand apart from nature in such a way that the interests that really move us should be concealed from us? Might there not be fewer of those interfamilial crimes, honor killings, child abandonments, if nature had made us straightforwardly aware that urgencies more or less our own were being served in our propagating and nurturing? There is more than a hint of dualism in the notion that some better self, the term seems fair, has to be distracted by ingratiating pleasures to accommodate the practical business of biology. This automaton language of Pinker's sounds a little bit like Descartes, but Descartes theorized that the pineal gland, central and singular in the symmetries of the brain, moved one way or another to permit or obstruct the actions of the body, which he knew were governed by the brain. In his theory, the impressions of the senses integrated in this gland were appraised by the soul, which in Descartes is a term that seems pointedly synonymous with the mind. That is to say, his interest is in cognition and reason, not sin or salvation, and this in a physical and intellectual landscape inflamed by theological controversy in which those concepts figure prominently. Still, it is the soul that appraises what the mind integrates. In this way, Descartes acknowledges the complexity of thinking, judging, and in his way incorporates the feeling of consciousness and the complexity of it more adequately than most theorists do now. He speaks of the mind, which he calls, quote, I, that is to say, the mind by which I am what I am, end quote, in ways that assume it is nevertheless accessible to instruction and correction by an I that stands apart from it. To correct the syntax of his thinking so that the anomaly is removed would be to deprive it of its power as testimony. We do indeed continuously stand apart from ourselves, appraising. Every higher act of the mind, intellectual, aesthetic, or moral, is, paradoxically, also an exercise in self-doubt and self-scrutiny. What Descartes actually intended by the words soul and mind seems to me an open question for Descartes himself. Clearly, they are no mere ghost or illusion. No doubt there are volumes to be consulted on this subject. What their meanings are for us as inheritors of the thought of the modern period is a more manageable question. I am excluding the kind of thinking on this point that tends toward the model of the wager. According to this model, we place our faith in an understanding of the one thing needful and ultimately suffer or triumph depending on the correctness of our choice. By these lights, the soul exists primarily to be saved or lost. It is hardly more our intimate companion in mortal time than is the mind or brain by the reckoning of the positivists, behaviorists, neo-Darwinists, and Freudians. The soul, in this understanding of it, is easily characterized by the non-religious as a fearful and self-interested idea, as the product of acculturation or a fetish of the primitive brain, rather than as a name for an aspect of deep experience. Therefore, it is readily dismissed as a phantom of the mind, and the mind is all the more readily dismissed for its harboring of such fears and delusions. Descartes complains that philosophers of the, I'm quoting Descartes, Descartes complains, quote, the philosophers of the schools accept as a maxim that there is nothing in the understanding which was not previously in the senses. The strictures of this style of thought are indeed very old. It strikes me that the word senses is in need of definition. As it is used, even by these schoolmen, it seems to signify only those means by which we take in information about our environment, including our own bodies, presumably. Steven Pinker says, quote, the faculty with which we ponder the world has no ability to peer inside itself or our other faculties to see what makes them tick. That makes us victims of an illusion that our own psychology comes from some divine force or mysterious essence or almighty principle, end of quote. But the mind or the brain, a part of the body, just as Wilson says it is deeply sensitive to itself. Guilt, nostalgia, the pleasure of anticipation, even the shock of a realization, all arise out of an event that occurs entirely in the mind or brain, and they are as potent as other sensations. Consistency would require a belief in the non-physical character of the mind to exclude them from the general category of experience. I'm going to read that sentence over again. Consistency would require a belief in the non-physical character of the mind to exclude these sensations from the general category of experience. If it is objected that all these things are ultimately dependent on images and sensations first gleaned from the world by the senses, this might be granted on the condition that the sensory experience retained in the mind is understood to have the character the mind has given it. And it might be granted if sensory experience is understood to function as language does, both enabling thought and conforming it in large part to its own context, its own limitations. Anyone's sensory experience of the world is circumstantial and cultural, qualified by context and perspective, a fact which again suggests that the mind's awareness of itself is of a kind with its awareness of physical reality. The mind, like the body, is very much placed in the world. Those who claim to dismiss the mind-body dichotomy actually perpetuate it when they exclude the mind's self-awareness from among the data of human nature. By self-awareness, I do not mean merely consciousness of one's identity or of the complex flow of thought, perception, memory, and desire, important as these are. I mean primarily the self that stands apart from itself, that questions, reconsiders, appraises. I have read that microorganisms can equip themselves with genes useful to their survival, that is, genes conferring resistance to antibiotics, by choosing them out of the ambient flux of organic material. This is not a pretty metaphor, but it makes a point. If a supposedly simple entity can by any means negotiate its own enhancement, then an extremely complex entity, largely composed of those lesser entities, that is, a human being, should be assumed to have analogous capabilities. For the purposes of the mind, these might be called conscience or aspiration. We receive their specific forms culturally and historically as the microorganism, our contemporary, does also when it absorbs the consequences of other germs' encounters with the human pharmacopoeia. Let us say that social pathologies can be associated with traumatic injuries to certain regions of the brain, and that the unimpaired brain has the degree of detachment necessary to report to us when our behavior might be, as they say in the corrections community, inappropriate. Then what grounds can there be for doubting that a sufficient biological account of the brain would yield the complex phenomenon we know and experience as the mind? It is only the pertinacity of the mind-body dichotomy that sustains the notion that a sufficient biological account of the brain would be reductionist in the negative sense. Such thinking is starkly at odds with our awareness of the utter brilliance of the physical body. I do not myself believe that such an account of the brain will ever be made. Present research methods show the relatively greater activity of specific regions of the brain in response to certain stimuli or in the course of certain mental or physical behaviors. But in fact, it hardly seems possible that in practice the region of the brain that yields speech would not be deeply integrated with the regions that govern social behavior, as well as memory and imagination, to degrees varying with circumstance. Nor does it seem possible that each of these would not, under all circumstances, profoundly modify the others, in keeping with learning and with inherited and other qualities specific to any particular brain. What should we call the presiding intelligence that orchestrates the decision to speak as a moment requires? What governs the inflections that make any utterance unmistakably the words of one speaker in this whole language-saturated world? To say it is the brain is insufficient, overgeneral, implying nothing about nuance and individuation. Much better to call it the mind. If the brain at the level of complex and nuanced interaction with itself does indeed become mind, then the reductionist approach insisted upon by writers on the subject is not capable of yielding evidence of mind's existence, let alone an account of its functioning. One who has inquired into the properties of hydrogen and oxygen might reasonably conclude that water is a highly combustible gas, if there were not his own experience to discourage this conclusion. As proof of the existence of mind, we have only history and civilization, art, science, and philosophy, and at the same time, of course, that extraordinary individuation. If it is true that the mind can know and seek to know itself in ways analogous to its experience of the world, then there are more richer data to be gleaned from every age and every culture, and from every moment of introspection, of deep awareness of the self. To return briefly to the notion of multiverses, there is no reason I am aware of to doubt that our known reality is one of an endless number of realities, most of them ephemeral and unhaunted, presumably, though that is speculation. This hypothesis is so convenient to those who wish to minimize the significance of the apparent fine-tuning of our universe to allow for the existence of life, and so inaccessible to disproof that there is something a little comic about it. Still, lifted out of the polemical context in which it is often to be found, the notion seems plausible enough. Why should there be or have been only one great singularity, one great surge of cosmos? Our universe is sufficient to prepare our imaginations for plenitude on an even grander scale. So, granting the plausibility of the idea, what does it imply? Its power, when it is used polemically, is based on the fact that, in a multiverse, absolutely anything is possible. Take that, Reverend Paley. Still, it does draw attention to the givenness, the arbitrariness, one might even say the narrowness of the protocols that govern our reality. Everything we take to be essential could be the accident of a peculiar history, a warp or an asymmetry in this one emergence that eventuated as time or as gravity. To say that everything could be utterly different from universe to universe itself suggests infinite variance on a substructure of reality whose existence it is surely an error to assume. If it would still be meaningful to say there are an infinite number of universes, if their profound otherness did not embarrass even the language of being itself, then our experience of being is obviously far too minor and partial to support generalization. If something we could discern and recognize as intelligent life were to occur in certain of these other realities, might we not learn that our notions of intelligence were, so to speak, parochial? Might we not reconsider our ideas of intelligence as it occurs here on Earth? If the question seems fanciful, the use, if not the point, of the multiverse hypothesis is precisely to enlarge or even to explode conventional and restrictive notions of the possible. My point is simply that the ancient assumption of parascience, that we are playing with a full deck, that we can proceed from an understanding of reality that is in every important sense sufficient, is a feature of the literature carried forward from a primitive notion of what sufficiency would be. On one hand, we have the most ancient and universal theological intuition that the order we see exists by divine fiat, that the heavens proclaim the glory of God. And on the other hand, we have this late development in cosmological speculation, the notion that the reality we experience is arbitrary, being one manifestation of an infinitely greater potentiality. I run the risk here of seeming to theologize science or to use scientific speculation to vindicate theology. This is true only in that, in both cases, the sense of the arbitrariness of given reality allows the human mind to see around its edges, so to speak, to acknowledge the potential in the interstices of the actual. To clarify this point, I will quote a sharply contrasting view expressed by E.O. Wilson in the last chapter of his book On Human Nature, published in 1979. Quote, "The core of scientific materialism is the evolutionary epic. Let me repeat its minimum claims. That the laws of the physical sciences are consistent with those of the biological and social sciences and can be linked in chains of causal explanation. That life and mind have a physical basis. That the world as we know it has evolved from earlier worlds obedient to the same laws, and that the visible universe today is everywhere subject to these materialist explanations." I confess to finding this language unclear. I think I am fair to Wilson in taking him to mean that the physical and social sciences are coextensive and that the laws of the first can therefore be presumed to govern the second, at least in principle or by extension, a notion already asserted in the 19th century by Auguste Comte. What this would mean in practice is still difficult to imagine, however, even putting to one side the question of whether the social sciences are in fact sciences, or are methodical and testable enough to identify in themselves the workings of the kinds of apparently universal constants it is customary to call laws. I take it to mean that this world has passed through stages of evolution, each of which would have been comprehensible in the terms of our understanding of, in Wilson's phrase, quote, "the visible universe." A fair amount has happened in science since the publication of this book in 1979. We know now that only a small fraction of the universe is in any sense visible, that the adjective dark is now applied to most of it, meaning that the presence of unanticipated forms of matter and energy can be discerned or inferred, though not explained. He says explained, that's not a word I would choose. Of course, these must be assumed to be in principle, quote, subject to materialist explanations, though I would rephrase this as available to tentative description in terms science finds meaningful. But these phenomena demonstrate, as physics and cosmology tend to do, that the strangeness of reality consistently exceeds the expectations of science, and that the assumptions of science, however tried and rational, are very inclined to encourage false expectations. As a notable example, no one expected to find that the expansion of the universe is accelerating, and that the rate of its acceleration is accelerating. It is a tribute to the brilliance of science that we can know such things. And it is also an illustration of the fact that science does not foreclose possibility, including discoveries that overturn very fundamental assumptions, and that it is not a final statement about reality, but a highly fruitful mode of inquiry into it. The fact of the accelerating expansion of the universe is a conclusion arrived at in the first place by observation. Theory and hypothesis have followed. What was thought to be known about the effect of gravity, that it would slow cosmic expansion, could not be reconciled with new data, and a major and novel factor, in effect an antigravitational force, emerged as a hypothesis in a changed conception of the universe. The best wisdom and the most venerable of natural laws do not have standing to preclude our acknowledging solid data, though the grounds for refusing to take account of them could perfectly well be called scientific. The exclusion of what the brain does from an account of what the brain is scientific, in just the same sense. By this kind of reasoning, the laws of nature supposedly tell us what we must exclude from what we might otherwise consider entirely relevant, one example being our own inwardness. This distinction between science and quote-unquote science is important in considering the mind over against the materialist position that would understand it in reductionist terms, that is, in terms that limit the kinds of interpretation that are appropriately brought to bear on it. The neo-Darwinists argue that the brain evolved to maximize the chance of genetic survival, to negotiate access to food and sex, presumably before the species evolved to the point where the prolonged helplessness of infants made genetic survival dependent in some degree on cooperation. Therefore, they tell us we may not assume that any motive can depart from an essential qualitative likeness to these original motives. The evolutionary epic explains the brain exhaustively. But the material itself is an artifact of the scale at which we perceive. We know that we abide with quarks and constellations in a reality unknowable by us in a degree that we will never be able to calculate. But reality all the same, the stuff and the matrix of our supposedly quotidian existence. We know that within, throughout, the solid substantiality of our experience, indeterminacy reigns. Making use of the conceptual vocabulary of science to exclude a possibility that in a present state of knowledge, or a former one, that vocabulary would seem to exclude, has been the mission of positivist thinking since Auguste Comte declared scientific knowledge effectively complete. If doing so is a reflex of the polemical impulse to assert the authority of science, understandable when the project was relatively new, it is by now an atavism that persists as a consequence of this same polemical impulse. The ancient antagonist that has shaped positivism and parascientific thought and continues to inspire missionary zeal is religion. For cultural and historical reasons, the religions against which it has opposed itself are Christianity and Judaism, both of which must be called anthropologies, whatever else. What is man that thou art mindful of him? The very question is an assertion that mindfulness is an attribute of God, as well as man, a statement of a sense of deep meaning inhering in it. If I were not myself a religious person but wished to make an account of religion, I believe I would tend toward the Feuerbachian view that religion is a human projection of humanity's conceptions of beauty, goodness, power, and other valued things a humanizing of experience by understanding it is structured around and mirroring back these values. Then it would resemble art, with which it is strongly associated. But this would dignify religion and characterize the mind as outwardly and imaginatively engaged with the world, as in parascientific thought, after Comte, it never is. Sigmund Freud, in Civilization and Its Discontents, says of religion, quote, "The whole thing is so patently infantile, so foreign to reality, that to anyone with a friendly attitude to humanity, it is painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view of life." End of quote. Then 2 pages on, he says, "The question of the purpose of human life has been raised countless times. It has never received a satisfactory answer and perhaps does not admit of one. Once again," still quoting Freud, "once again, only religion can answer the question of the purpose of life. One can hardly be wrong in concluding that the idea of life having a purpose stands and falls with the religious system." That's Freud. And then he says, quote, "As we see," I'm very, very close, a few pages after, "as we see, what decides the purpose of life is simply the program of the pleasure principle. This principle dominates the operation of the mental apparatus from the start. There can be no doubt about its efficacy, and yet its program is at loggerheads with the whole world, with the macrocosm as much as with the microcosm. There is no possibility at all of its being carried through. All the regulations of the universe run counter to it." End of quote. It seems a little strange that religion is infantile, but the desire of pleasure for pleasure, which, quote, "dominates the operation of the mental apparatus from the start," is not, or not at least in any pejorative sense. It seems strange as well that though there, quote, "there is no possibility at all of its being carried out, the program of the pleasure principle is not also, like religion, foreign to reality." Steven Pinker says, "Religion is a desperate measure that people resort to when the stakes are high and they have exhausted the usual techniques for the causation of success." End of quote. Then a little farther on, he lists the imponderables that lie behind the human tendency toward religion and also philosophy. These imponderables are consciousness in the sense of sentience or subjective experience, the self, free will, conceptual meaning, knowledge, and morality. He says, quote, "Maybe philosophical problems are hard not because they are divine or irreducible or meaningless or workaday science, but because the mind of Homo sapiens lacks the cognitive equipment to solve them. We are organisms, not angels, and our brains are organs, not pipelines to the truth." How odd that these imponderables should be just the kind of thing humankind have pondered endlessly. Neo-Darwinism allows for hypertrophy, the phenomenon by which evolution overshoots its mark and produces some consequence not strictly useful to the ends of genetic replication, the human brain as case in point. How strange it would be, then, that this accident, this excess, should feel a tropism toward what Pinker himself calls the truth. The great difference between parascientific thought on one hand and religion and traditional philosophy on the other is perhaps encapsulated in that word solved, assuming the use of the word is not simply a casual imprecision. It does seem as though, for the purposes of these writers, science is the conquest of mystery, as it was for Auguste Comte and as it certainly was not for Isaac Newton. A difference between a Newton and a Comte, between science and parascience, is the desire in the latter case to treat scientific knowledge as complete, at least in its methods and assumptions, in order to further the primary object of closing questions about human nature and the human circumstance. Science has arrived at a cluster of impressive hypotheses about the first instant of creation. They attempt description in the manner of science. In course of time, on various grounds, one description might prove to be more satisfactory than others. A consensus might be arrived at about the nature of that very fecund particle whose eruption became everything we know and a great deal more beside. We might learn at some point whether time was created together with this universe or exists independently of it. The questions to which science in its most sophisticated forms has come would have been the imponderables of philosophy a few generations ago, of theology a few centuries ago, of religion a few millennia ago. Why this ancient instinct for the greatest questions? It is striking that Freud identifies religion with the meaning of life, and Pinker identifies it with the higher order questions humankind has posed to itself from antiquity. When both writers for all purposes dismiss these things as insoluble, as if that were a legitimate reason to dismiss any question. We may never know why gravity is so much weaker than, in theory, it should be, or know if we are only one among any number of actual and potential universes. But every real question is fruitful, as the history of human thought so clearly demonstrates. And fruitful is by no means a synonym for soluble. What is man? One answer on offer is an organism whose haunting questions perhaps ought not to be meaningful to the organ that generates them, lacking as it is in any means of solving them. Another answer might be, it is still too soon to tell. We might be the creature who brings life on this planet to an end, and we might be the creature who awakens to the privileges that inhere in our nature, selfhood, consciousness, even our biologically anomalous craving for the truth, and enjoys and enhances them. Mysteriously, neither possibility precludes the other. Our nature will describe itself as we respond to new circumstances in a world that changes continuously. So long as the human mind exists to impose itself on reality, as it has already done so profoundly, what it is and what we are must remain an open question. In order to arrive at a parascientific view of humankind, we are obliged to put to one side whatever is not to be accounted for in the apparently simple terms of genetic self-interest. I say apparently simple because in every instance these theorists build in devices to account for the inadequacies of their theories. The Ptolemaic model of the universe worked well enough given certain cogs and wheels, epicycles, and deferents. These theorists speak of the old error, that notion of a ghost in the machine, the image of the felt difference between mind and body. But who and what is that other self they posit, that hypertrophic self who has considered the heavens since Babylon and considers them still by elegant and ingenious means whose refinements express a formidable pressure of desire to see and know beyond the limits of any conception of utility, certainly any neo-Darwinist conception of it? Who is that other self needing to be persuaded that there are more than genetic reasons for rescuing a son or daughter from drowning? The archaic conundrum, how a non-physical spirit can move a physical body, only emerges in a more pointed form in these unaccountable presences, whom evolution has supposedly contrived to make us mistake for ourselves. These epigones exist because without them the theories would fail the test of comparison with human experience. Merely shift the balance toward manifest behavior, assuming that the genes do indeed look after themselves in ways and degrees we most likely cannot yet describe, but in any case that their functioning is consistent with manifest behavior. Then human nature in its wholeness and complexity is restored as an unsolved problem, but as a phenomenon endlessly offering a very burdened testimony. Each of us lives intensely within herself or himself, continuously assimilating past and present experience to a narrative and vision that are unique in every case, yet profoundly communicable, whence the arts. And we all live in a great reef of collective experience, past and present, that we receive and preserve and modify. William James says data should be thought of not as givens, but as gifts. This by way of maintaining an appropriate humility in the face of what we think we know. The gifts we bring to the problem of making an account of the mind are overwhelmingly rich, severally and together. This is not an excuse for excluding them from consideration. History and civilization are an authoritative record of the mind has left, is leaving, and will leave, and objectivity deserving the name would take this record as a starting point. In practical terms, this would mean doing as the humanists have done since the building of the Library of Alexandria, more or less. Humankind never ceases to express itself in new terms, and the data at hand are inevitably flawed and partial, but the complexity of the object, the human brain, and all associated phenomena are at the center of the question, inextricable from it. The schools of thought I have criticized exclude the great fact of human exceptionalism, though no one would deny that it is a pure expression of the uniqueness of the human brain. A primary assumption of the evolutionary model behind neo-Darwinism is that development can be traced back through a series of subtly incremental changes. At what for our purposes is the terminus of all these changes, there emerges, voila, the world as we know it. The neatness of this argument has always bothered me, but this is no refutation of it, nor am I interested in refuting it. I wish only to point out that there are certain things it should not be taken to imply. For example, it does not imply that a species carries forward an essential similarity to its ancestors. A bird is not a latter-day dinosaur. We can assume the ancestors ate and slept and mated, carrying on the universal business of animal life. Still, whatever the shared genetic history of beast and bird, a transformative change occurred over the millennia, and to find the modern sparrow implicit in the thunder lizard is quite certainly an error, if one wishes to make an ornithological study of sparrow behavior. On the same grounds, there is no reason to assume our species resembles in any essential way the ancient primates whose genes we carry. It is a strategy of parascientific argument to strip away culture-making as if it were a ruse and a concealment within which lurked the imagined primitive who is for them our true nature. Here is another instance of evolution to illustrate my point. The universe passed through its unimaginable first moment, first year, first billion years, wresting itself from whatever state of non-existence, inflating, contorting, resolving into space and matter, bursting into light. Matter condenses, stars live out their generations, then very late, there is added to the universe of being a shaped stick or stone, a jug, a cuneiform tablet. They appear on a tiny, teetering, lopsided planet, and they demand wholly new vocabularies of description for reality at every scale. What but the energies of the universe could be expressed in the Great Wall of China, the St. Matthew's Passion? For our purposes, there is nothing else. Yet language that would have been fully adequate to describe the age before the appearance of the first artifact would have had to be enlarged by concepts like agency and intention, words like creation, that would query the great universe itself. Might not the human brain, that most complex object known to exist in the universe, have undergone a qualitative change as well? If my metaphor only suggests the possibility that our species is more than an optimized ape, that something terrible and glorious befell us, a change gradualism could not predict, if this is merely another fable, it might at least encourage an imagination of humankind large enough to acknowledge some small fragment of the mystery we are. Thank you. Here I am. We're closing down shop now. This is the last time you'll have to ask me a question.
You're next.
Do you accept or agree with Karl Popper's definition of a scientific statement?
That it can be falsified?
Yes.
Well, you know, so much of the most interesting science now is not falsifiable.
Well, I don't say it's parascience. I say it's not science. I like Papa.
Well, lots of people do, but I think that that's too restrictive a definition. We just come to the limits of that very suddenly in terms of contemporary thought. Yes.
There's a question that's been on my mind over the course of the lectures, and that is what you think of social science, especially the analysis of how power shapes human thought and just the categories in which we can think of, sort of Michel Foucault's analysis of how those categories shape thought, maybe someone like Talal Assad. Is social science a science? What can it tell us about the questions that you've been raising?
Well, you know, I'm always thinking about context. It's a compulsion of mine. And I'm amazed, frankly, by the willingness of Americans to incorporate, for example, French categories. Because, you know, they have a wildly different history, a wildly different relationship to their landscape, a different ethnography, a different, you know, you don't have to be in France long before you find out that the intellectual landscape is differently arrayed, you know. I think that a lot of, if you read Foucault as a French writer, and then you read what Americans make of him, I think they're mistranslating. And I don't mean in the technical sense, I mean in the broadest sense. And so putting aside the value Foucault might have within his own universe of meaning, I'm sort of disheartened by the tendency of people to assume that they can just use a sort of cookie-cutter Foucaultianism in a completely different, a radically different civilization. If anything disheartens me about social science, that's at the top of my list.
I wonder if you would comment about the role of interpersonal relationships, particularly beginning with the mother and the infant, in the development of the sense of mind and the development of the sense of self.
Well, you know, as a mother, I tend to think it's incredibly important and lovely and all the rest of it. I must say, though, that I have, again, seeing to a certain extent how different cultures deal with child rearing, in ways that sometimes are rather shocking to me, and at the same time seeing the fairly estimable people that seem to come out of the other side of the process. I think that, I think that there's a profound human resilience. And I think that the resilience, to a very large degree, is based on an intuition that children have, unless they're really damaged, of who they are, you know, putting themselves together out of a sort of primary intuition of what attracts them and what they need and what they value and all the rest of it. I think I myself tried to be a superb mother, but at the same time, one of the things that worries me is the idea of damaged people. You know what I mean? As if, for example, it breaks down very readily into economic class kind of thinking and so on. I think the damage is more likely to occur when people feel that that's how they're viewed, you know, and that many of them, you know, given anything like a fair chance, have an extraordinary resilience. So I want to put the value on the baby, you know, the child, and simply, I would like to see a society that compensates much more effectively than it does for the fact that many people are not well dealt with as children. And I think the first help they could receive is an assumption of their respectable integrity, no matter what the story that lies behind them.
Then in a more constructive sense, the contemporary model of theory of mind, Baron Cohen, English, for example, feels that the sense of self in the child evolved because the mother has a sense of the child and communicates that to the child in her interaction with the child. So the child develops a sense of self because the mother has a sense of herself and a sense of the child's self. So it's a really very important aspect of the development of mind and the development of a sense of self.
I think that, I mean, certainly, to have a good mother enhances all these things. I don't think there can be any question about that. But at the same time, I think your sense of self is probably deeply intuitive, because your literal physical safety and so on is synonymous with your sense of self, your skin, and so I'm agnostic on that question.
I've heard you talk a lot about what is science and what's not science. I was just thinking, I haven't heard you talk a lot about what religion is, and I think I might be in a much more of a mystery about that had I not read your two most recent novels, and I think you get a sense of what you think of religion is from your fiction. But could you say something about that? And I particularly have in mind, I'm much more of a monist by tendency. I don't want there to be dualistic worlds and dualistic ways of thinking. So I would have a way of answering this question, but I was not sure what your answer would be, which would be, do you think that there is a different way of thinking that would be called scientific than a way of thinking that would be called religious? I guess I'm getting at the idea of, some people would say, well, even if you say religion is not irrational in a bad sense, you might say it's irrational or something, and that science is rational. That would be a traditional way of putting. But I would say, I just want to know, do you think there's a difference in ways of thinking between what we call science and what we call religion? No, I don't. I think that, one of the things that has to be, acknowledged is that there's a lot of bad science and there's a lot of bad religion, which is kind of the, I never got around to that second part. But nevertheless, and that's one of the things that makes it very difficult to generalize about religion and to make statements about the nature of religion in a public that is heavily influenced by, its televised forms and so on, St. Augustine is not as big in the conversation at this point as, name one of those television people. Pity. But I think that, it's a fairly recent thing that this cleavage between religion and science has occurred. Isaac Newton was a complete and utter mystic who spent all of his time learning ancient languages so that he could read biblical texts more profoundly and so on. I believe, frankly, very much in the religious authenticity of Descartes. The way that, I don't want to rope Einstein into this because he creates this haze of impenetrable language around himself, but he certainly had recourse to a kind of thinking a kind of language that reflected an impulse toward religious thought, So I don't, I think that the distinction between the two is polemical, rhetorical, artificial, and in a certain sense is the major symptom of the decay of the conversation on both sides. Yes?
Hi.
Hi.
Somebody said the universe is everything, including you, and the environment is everything, excluding you. If we take that we are our minds, then you seem to suggest that this environment-universe dichotomy doesn't exist, or is at least less distinct. And two people can watch the same film or eat a half of the same apple and talk about it, and the experience is largely universal. How much of my experience of my mind might be similar to your experience of your mind, and what implications might this have?
Well, it's certainly true that people communicate with each other at a very effective level, and that the everything that is universal and shared, the fact that the people in Connecticut can read Sophocles despite
the time and place and all the rest of it, certainly indicates, how, at the same time I just finished complaining about Michel Foucault, but, you get into these things, it's very, very complicated. And I don't know how, last time when I gave my lecture on altruism and someone spoke about altruistic behavior among people who themselves were very ill, that we are made to live as a human community. When I watch your facial expression, my mind mimics your facial expression. So that compassion is not just some sort of elaborate external construction. It's actually something that is physically present in the moment. All that sort of thing suggests that we understand each other otherwise than we normally would use that word. There's some people that you just instinctively do understand, even if you don't know them very well, and others that you have known for 30 years and don't understand. It's part of the mystery. I don't know. I can't really answer your question very well. But I would want to say, though, that I think that it's, I teach writing, and God rest the soul of Raymond Carver, but I was just as glad when because during Raymond Carver's dominance, everybody was Raymond Carver. But that has passed away now, and people are actually writing out of their own, minds and experience and the music, they hear in their heads. And it's the uniqueness of every piece is extremely striking. And I think that probably the uniqueness that you see of any accomplished piece of art is very striking. And one of the values we give it, the fact that we couldn't have done that same thing,
I agree with the people who think that environment, and I think you think it too, is a very important thing in our developments and who we are and what we are. But many people tend to think of the environment as just physical. That dichotomy that the young man talked about, people are taken out of the environment. But the most important environment for me is the people that I interact with.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I'm curious if you think the emphasis within some parts of contemporary cognitive science on a notion of emergence, on consciousness as an emergent property, represents an alternative to the kind of reductionism that you decry.
Well, anything that is less reductionist, of course, I would welcome. It seems to me as if, that you talk about layers of experience and all the rest of it, and you find out that you have in reserve a whole library of responses of recognition and so on that you would not otherwise be consciously aware of. I think that, one of the kind of mistakes that's been made by my lights, is that these things have tended to be broken down as somewhat antagonistic or, encapsulated impulse, or what should I say, encapsulated aspects of mind, when it seems to me like a fantastically efficient system of storage, that in the normal course of a day you know what you need to know, and when the moment comes that you need to know something else, there it is. So I don't know. I don't know enough probably about what you're talking about to answer as well as I ought to, but it just seems to me that there's an absence of wholeness, an absence of the self as a repository, an accessible repository of billions of things,
Hello. I regret to say that I'm just visiting New Haven, so this is the only one of your talks I've been able to hear. So I apologize if you've already covered this. What do you believe happens when we die? Do you believe in some idea of heaven, or?
Well, I expect to be impressed.
Good answer.
Hi, and thank you. Like so many people here, I've been so very influenced by your novels, and I was thinking of Housekeeping and Gilead as you were speaking, and I wonder, both books are really imbued with this sense of the realities of loss and impermanence and how they weigh on the human spirit, and I wonder if you think this sort of parascience and this attempt to essentialize and reduce human life is, in a sense, a way of fighting against sort of the pain of loss and impermanence and trying to make human life something more manageable for each of us and less of a difficult mystery.
I think that might be one way in which this kind of thinking is motivated. I think, I'm very influenced by the fact that I've just been reading world literature for, more years than I can imagine. But the people, you listen to music, you listen to the arts, the common language of understanding at that level absorbs huge quantities of pain and darkness and makes it really actually thrilling, And I think that one of the things that has not been allowed for in all this talk about, how we're modified by our need to survive and so on, is that human beings can, what can I say, put suffering outside themselves in a way that makes it sustain other, sustain them, sustain other people. I don't know how it works, but I certainly, I know from my own experience, from readers' responses and so on. Well, every once in a while I realize I've written 3 sad books. And I'm didn't intend to do that when I sat down with them, but nevertheless, very often I get letters from people who say, I was so comforted by the fact, my father was dying and I read this book with him or to him while, and so on. And I think that's amazing, at the same time that it's something that I think anyone has experienced. Something that breaks your heart sort of enlarges your life. It's amazing. But it, if anything should be called a survival trait, I think that's probably one. Yes.
I don't think this is quite well formulated, but since you brought up suffering there right at the end, I can't help but wonder about the status of those who have no possibility for putting suffering outside of themselves or for certain kinds of redemption. I mean, are there certain kinds of material conditions where the human experience is derealized in all its possibility? I'm thinking, this isn't that exceptional if we look at global reality. We can take instances like the Holocaust, but we can also just take extreme poverty in many parts of the world right now, and that resource culturally isn't there for a great many people. And so I'm wondering how that factors in to our definition and our understanding of soul. And you quoted that moment from Job, what is man that thou art mindful of him, which is a fascinating moment because, of course, on some level, Job is saying that moment is, how dare you punish me as significant? How dare you make me suffer because you care for me? Yeah. So it's really this moment it's kind of this desire for oblivion. The only thing that separates it from despair is that he keeps up the dialogue and gets to the end of the book. So I'm just wondering what we do with those kinds of, whether that parascience probably has no better answer for this, but certainly some of what you're suggesting seems to be the response to suffering is equated with soulfulness. Then what do we do with those experiences that don't have access to that?
Well, that passage in Job that you're mentioning here is actually sort of an inversion of Psalm 8, so that the resonance that it has, I think, I mean, it's the dark side of human significance, and very interesting. But the human significance is not questioned, even if it is felt as a burden by Job. A terrible burden. I mean, for me, one of the reasons that I am religious and believe in souls, and whatever that means, is because I do think that finally those souls are compensated. You know what I mean? That they are not lost, they are not wasted, those lives are not without meaning, and so on. I think that they will be impressed just right along with me. And I know that might sound escapist or something, but at the same time, it's so simultaneous with my idea of the profound worth of people that it would be an idea that I couldn't give up.
I was wondering what you thought of the Buddhist notion of no self, and how it relates, and so no self from the perspective of breaking down experience into and finding no inherence, and then the expansive notion of interdependence and no separation as a form of no self.
It would be an interesting experience of a kind that I can't claim ever to have had, but it seems to me that that in itself would be one of the most exquisite experiences of self. That's a profound extension of the capacities of the mind that must be rather thrilling.